For 5 years, I secretly paid my daughter and son-in-law's mortgage, more than $100,000, because I thought I was helping them get on their feet. Then, at a lavish banquet in honor of his promotion, my son-in-law raised his glass and joked that I had only come for the free food. Everyone laughed. I smiled too, but inside, something broke. That evening, I took my checkbook and made a decision that changed everything. But let's start at the beginning of the story. Sit back and here we go. 5 months ago, I found myself fussing in front of the bathroom mirror for far longer than I care to admit. At 70 years old, getting ready for an evening out is not the swift operation it once was. Back in my 40s, I could dab on a bit of lipstick, spritz perfume, and be out the door in 10 minutes. Now it takes me closer to 3 hours just to get my hair to stop looking like I've been electrocuted. I curled the silver strands carefully, set them with spray that smelled faintly of lemons, and said a little prayer they wouldn't collapse before dessert was served. I chose my teal dress, the one Harold, my late husband, had always said brought out the color in my eyes. He used to call it my Sunday dress, even though I'd worn it to more than one family gathering and one ill-fated church potluck where I ended up spilling baked beans down the front. But the stain was long gone, and the dress still fit. That in itself felt like a small miracle worth celebrating. I added a string of pearls, comfortable low heels, and just enough makeup to hide the years without pretending they weren't there. I wanted to look like myself, only slightly better, dignified, elegant, and proud enough for my daughter Caroline to say, "That's my mom." The venue was a country club on the edge of town, the kind of place where you can smell old money, even if the walls have been freshly painted. The moment I walked in, I was struck by the antique portraits lining the hallways, stern men with watch chains and women in lace collars, gazing down as if to say, "Don't put your elbows on the table, dear." The banquet hall itself glittered in a softer, more lived-in way. Ornate wall sconces threw golden light across the room, and the long tables were set with silverware polished so brightly I could almost see my reflection. Waiters in pressed white jackets floated by with trays of champagne flutes, and I accepted one, holding it delicately like I'd been taught at finishing school a lifetime ago. I lasted 2 weeks in that school before deciding I preferred pie baking to posture lessons, but the champagne etiquette stuck. Caroline looked radiant that evening in a navy gown that hugged her in all the right places. But I noticed the tension in her smile, the way her eyes darted toward arriving guests like she was playing hostess in a royal court. She kissed my cheek quickly before rushing off to greet Martin's superintendent and his wife. I waved after her, though she didn't see. So there I was, mother of the honoree's wife, left to mingle in a sea of suits and sparkly cocktail dresses. Most of the faces were unfamiliar: teachers, school board members, local politicians. People spoke quickly, laughed loudly, and eyed me politely before turning back to their own circles. I stationed myself near a tall vase of white lilies, sipping my champagne and trying not to look like I was hiding. When the band struck up a jazzy tune, Martin took the stage, his chest puffed out like a rooster who had just spotted a henhouse full of praise. I admit, he looked the part of success. Tall, polished, with that easy charm that had won Caroline over years ago. I wanted to be happy for him, truly. My hope, tucked secretly in my heart, was that this big promotion might mean the end of the financial helping hand I'd been giving them. But that thought stayed firmly inside me. Outwardly I smiled, clapped, and lifted my glass. Martin began his speech, thanking his colleagues, his mentors, his incredible wife. The room applauded, and Caroline beamed from her seat near the front. Then his eyes found mine in the back corner, and I knew, that something was coming. He paused, smirked, and said, "And my mother-in-law is here tonight, bless her. I'm pretty sure she only showed up because there's free food." The laughter that followed wasn't the warm, shared kind you hear at family tables. It was sharp, jagged, the kind people use when they don't know if they should laugh but do anyway because they're afraid not to. I sat frozen, champagne glass in hand, heat rising to my cheeks. I smiled anyway. That's what women my age are trained to do: smile, nod, pretend the sting isn't there. But inside something cracked. In that moment, beneath the glow of the sconces and the sound of forced laughter, I realized I wasn't family to Martin. Not really. To him I was a punchline. And though no one else noticed, I felt the first flicker of a fire I hadn't known was still in me. The next morning, I was right where I always begin my day, at my little oak kitchen table, the one Harold and I bought secondhand in 1974. The surface is scratched in places, stained with decades of coffee cups, and there's one faint burn mark from the time I thought using a teapot warmer directly on the wood was a good idea. It isn't fancy, but it's mine, and it has held everything from birthday cakes to unpaid bills. That morning it held my checkbook. For 5 years, 60 long months, I had been sending $1,900 to Caroline and Martin's mortgage company. Every month on the dot. If you're doing the math, that adds up to $114,000. I don't need a calculator to tell me it's a mountain of money, enough to buy myself a nice little condo in Florida, or at least a used convertible so I could ride around town like a sassy retiree with my hair blowing in the wind. Instead, all that money had gone to keep Caroline and Martin in a house they never should have bought in the first place. I told myself it was only temporary. Caroline had come to me, eyes big and voice trembling, saying they just needed a few years until Martin's career took off. They had fallen in love with that big suburban house. Vaulted ceilings, granite counters, more bathrooms than 2 people could ever possibly use, and couldn't bear to let it slip away. She said, "Mom, it would devastate Martin if anyone knew you were helping. Promise you'll keep it between us?" And like the world's biggest fool, I nodded. I thought I was protecting his pride. Looking back, I was really protecting their entitlement. So there I sat, pen in hand, checkbook open. Habit told me to write the numbers neatly in the box, sign my name carefully, and slide the check into the envelope. But Martin's little free food comment from the night before replayed in my head like a broken record. The smirk, the laughter, the way people glanced at me like I was some odd charity case instead of the woman who had been quietly keeping that roof over their heads. Something in me snapped, or maybe it finally unsnapped after years of being twisted into knots. My hand stopped before filling in the date. Instead of neat numbers and my signature, I wrote one word across the entire check in bold, steady letters. Canceled. I didn't shake. My heart didn't race. In fact, I felt calmer than I had in years. It was as if that single word broke invisible chains I hadn't realized I'd been dragging. For once, I wasn't bailing anyone out. I wasn't covering up poor choices. I wasn't pretending everything was fine. The strangest part? I didn't feel guilty. Not one bit. I actually chuckled to myself, thinking how Harold would have grinned if he'd seen me do it. He'd spent his whole life making sure I'd be comfortable in retirement, and here I was giving his savings away like coupons at a grocery store. Not anymore, I muttered, patting the checkbook as though it were an old dog finally learning a new trick. I put the canceled check back in the drawer and made myself a cup of coffee. It tasted better than usual, rich, bold, almost celebratory. I sat back in my chair, looking out at the maple tree Harold had planted decades ago. Its branches swayed gently, as if nodding in approval. For the first time in years, I felt free. It didn't take long for the phone to ring. The very next morning, just as I was finishing my toast, the screen lit up with Caroline's name. Now, a mother always hopes her grown daughter is calling to say, "Good morning, Mom. How are you?" But the tone of her voice the second I picked up told me I was not about to get a sweet little chat. "Mom, what on earth did you do?" she shrieked. "The bank called Martin this morning. The mortgage payment bounced. Do you have any idea what you've done to our credit score?" I calmly took a sip of my coffee. "Good morning to you too, sweetheart." That only made her angrier. "This isn't funny, Mom. You sabotaged us. We have a payment history to maintain and you've ruined it. Do you realize what this means for our future? For our ability to refinance? For everything we've worked for?" Now, I try not to interrupt my children when they're wound up like that. I let her rant for a good 5 minutes, pacing around my kitchen with the phone to my ear, making little noises while I rinsed my dishes. At one point she shouted, "You're abandoning us." I nearly dropped the plate I was holding. Abandoning them? I had practically bankrolled their adult lives. Finally, when she paused for air, I said, "Caroline, let's put things into perspective. Over the past 5 years, I have paid 60 monthly checks at $1,900 each. That adds up to $114,000. $114,000. That is not abandonment. That is generosity." There was a pause. Then she snorted like I had just told her I found a dime on the sidewalk. "So what, Mom? That money was supposed to help us get ahead. You can't hold that over us now. It's not like you need it. You live alone, you don't travel, you don't have expenses. What else are you going to spend it on?" I swear I nearly laughed out loud, as if being careful with my money meant I was obligated to hand it over to her and Martin. But before I could deliver the speech building in my chest, she pivoted strategies. Caroline has always been clever, too clever for her own good sometimes. When logic failed, she went straight for guilt. Her voice softened into that syrupy tone she used as a little girl when she wanted a bigger scoop of ice cream. Dad would be so disappointed in you, Mom. And there it was. The dagger. She knew Harold's name was the one word that could cut through my armor. For a moment I did feel the sting. My Harold, steady, kind, hard-working. Would he be disappointed? The thought twisted in my chest like an ache I couldn't quite rub out. But then a new thought followed, sharp and clear. Disappointed in me? No. Harold would be disappointed in her. Disappointed that his daughter and her husband had drained my retirement and then mocked me publicly on top of it. So I steadied my voice and said, "No, Caroline. Your father would be disappointed in the way you're treating me." There was silence on the line. Not the comfortable kind, not the thoughtful kind, but the heavy, stunned kind. I imagined her standing there in her big kitchen with its shiny granite counters, phone clutched to her ear, mouth open like a fish. Felt good. Felt right. For once I hadn't backed down, hadn't tried to smooth things over. I had spoken the truth, plain and simple, and the silence that followed told me she knew it too. A few days later, my son Daniel stopped by. Now, Daniel has always been the calm one, the mediator, the let's all just take a breath type. As a boy, he used to stand between Caroline and her cousins whenever they got into squabbles, waving his little hands like a traffic cop. That part of him never changed. Even as a grown man, he's the family's peacemaker. He walked in carrying a bag of bagels, which is his way of buttering me up before difficult conversations. We sat at the kitchen table, the same oak table that had heard more family drama than most daytime soap operas, and he cleared his throat. "Mom," he began, "Caroline told me you stopped helping them because of Martin's joke at the party." He looked uncomfortable, shifting in his chair. "She says you're being a little petty." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Petty?" I said, setting my mug down with a clink. "Daniel, do you know how many checks I've written for that house?" His eyebrows knitted together. "She mentioned you'd helped out, but..." "Helped out?" I interrupted, practically laughing. "For 5 years I've been paying their mortgage. That's $1,900 every single month. 60 checks. Do the math." He blinked, did some quick mental calculations, and his jaw actually dropped. Mom, that's over $114,000. "Correct," I said, tapping the table for emphasis. "And that's not even including the emergencies." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Emergencies?" "Oh yes," I said, rolling my eyes. "The car repair that turned out to be a new SUV. The roof repair that magically coincided with them getting a sunroom. Martin's dental work, which I suspect was elective whitening. They always called in tears, saying it was urgent. And like a fool, I wrote the checks." Daniel rubbed his forehead like he had a headache. "I had no idea." I gave him a look. "That's because Caroline made me promise not to tell anyone. Said it would humiliate Martin. Apparently, his pride is more fragile than a soap bubble." He sighed, and for a moment I thought he was going to scold me. But instead he said quietly, "Mom, Martin calls you something behind your back." I frowned. "What does he call me?" Daniel hesitated, then muttered, "The Bank of Elaine." For a moment I thought my heart had stopped. The words landed like a weight in my chest. The Bank of Elaine. That's all I was to them. A source of cash with gray hair and a checkbook. I sat very still, letting it sink in. As if the universe wanted to twist the knife a little deeper. My neighbor Agnes popped by later that same afternoon. She's the kind of woman who always shows up with a casserole when she senses something is amiss. Sure enough, she had a steaming dish of macaroni and cheese in her hands. We sat at the table, and after a few pleasantries, she leaned in and lowered her voice. "Elaine, I don't mean to gossip, but I think you ought to know something. At the Thompson barbecue last month, I overheard Martin talking near the drinks table." I braced myself. "What did he say?" Agnes looked apologetic. "He was bragging to some folks. Said it was mighty convenient having a mother-in-law who was, and these were his exact words, a walking retirement fund in a shawl." I pressed my napkin to my mouth, partly to hide my expression and partly because I thought I might actually gasp aloud. A walking retirement fund in a shawl. That was it. The moment everything crystallized. This wasn't just ingratitude. It wasn't a slip of the tongue at a party or a bad joke. It was a pattern, a mindset, an entire view of me that reduced my love, my sacrifice, and my late husband's hard-earned savings to a punchline. And in that instant, I stopped feeling guilty for closing my checkbook. A week after Caroline's outburst and Agnes's casserole delivery, I decided it was time to face the numbers head-on. I had always prided myself on keeping tidy records. Harold used to joke that I could run the Treasury Department with nothing more than my accordion file and a box of pencils. Every check I'd ever written to Caroline and Martin was neatly recorded in my ledger, but I had never dared to add them all together. It was easier to think of them as helping out here and there, rather than one giant mountain of money. So, I made an appointment with my financial advisor, Sylvia. She's a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with the kind of bob haircut that says, "I've got spreadsheets for days." I've worked with her since Harold passed, and she has never sugar-coated anything. If you're about to run out of savings, she'll tell you flat out, though she'll also offer you a mint while she does it. I sat across from her polished mahogany desk, clutching my folder of records like it was a shield. She adjusted her glasses, pulled up my account history, and began tapping on her keyboard. After a few minutes, she swiveled the monitor slightly so I could see. "Elaine," she said, "I want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. For 5 years, you've been making monthly payments of $1,900 directly to your daughter's mortgage company?" I nodded, feeling my cheeks flush. "That's correct. 60 payments in all." She clicked through more screens. "And in addition, I see numerous withdrawals labeled as loans or family support. $4,000 here, $7,500 there, one marked medical emergency for $3,200, another for roof repair at $4,800. Do you recall all these?" "Oh yes," I said wearily. Everyone came with a phone call. Caroline in tears or Martin sounding panicked. Always urgent, always framed as if the whole world would fall apart if I didn't write that check. So I did. Sylvia leaned back in her chair, lips pressed into a thin line. Then she tapped a few more keys and turned the screen fully toward me. "Adding it all up, between the mortgage payments and these so-called emergencies, you've given them approximately $153,000 in the past 5 years." For a moment, the number didn't register. My eyes saw it, my ears heard it, but my brain refused to accept it. $153,000. Almost a third of the savings Harold had worked his entire life to leave me. My stomach twisted as though I'd eaten something rotten. I sat very still, gripping the arms of my chair. "That much?" I whispered. Sylvia nodded, her tone softening. "Elaine, I don't think you fully realize the scale of this. And I have to tell you, the pattern of repeated withdrawals, the secrecy, the emotional manipulation, this isn't just generosity. This is financial abuse." I winced at the word, but deep down I knew she was right. If another woman had sat across from me and told me the same story, I would have recognized it immediately. But when it's your own daughter, your own family, the lines blur. Sylvia leaned forward. "I need you to understand something. Abuse like this doesn't stop on its own. Once someone grows accustomed to having access to your money, they won't simply let it go. They will push, guilt, and manipulate until they get what they want. That's why I strongly recommend you meet with an elder law attorney. Protect your assets now before it gets worse." I exhaled slowly, the weight of her words settling over me. For the first time, I stopped making excuses for Caroline. I stopped pretending this was just a rough patch or that she and Martin were doing their best. For the first time in years, I started making plans. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I had just poured myself a glass of iced tea and was settling into my armchair with a quilting magazine when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I certainly wasn't expecting them. But when I peeked through the little frosted window, there they were. Caroline with her arms crossed, Martin right behind her clutching a thick folder like he was about to present at a school board meeting. Before I could even say hello, Caroline swept inside with that tight smile she uses when she's furious but wants to appear polite. "Mom, we need to talk." Martin followed, setting his folder down on my coffee table like it was the Holy Grail. "Elaine, we've run the numbers. You can absolutely afford to keep helping us." I raised an eyebrow. Well, isn't that considerate of you to audit my finances? He opened the folder with a dramatic flourish, revealing a spreadsheet full of color-coded boxes and pie charts. See here? If you contribute $2,000 a month, it barely dents your savings. You'll still have more than enough for yourself. And it gives us stability. I don't know what came over me, but I laughed. Loud, unladylike, belly-shaking laughter. The kind Harold used to say made the neighbors wonder what was so funny at the Johnson house. I laughed right in Martin's face. He didn't like that one bit. His jaw tightened. Caroline leaned forward, her voice sharp. Mom, this isn't a joke. We're counting on you. We've structured our entire budget around your support. I wiped a tear from my eye and said, well, perhaps that was your first mistake. That's when the gloves came off. Martin's polished principal voice slipped, replaced by something meaner, nastier. You're being ungrateful. After everything we've done for you. Who drove you to the hospital last year when you fell? Who invites you over for holidays? I tilted my head. Inviting me over for Thanksgiving dinner that I end up cooking half of doesn't exactly put you in the category of saints. Caroline gasped. I can't believe you're saying this. Martin leaned closer, his eyes hard. No wonder Harold worked himself to death, living with someone as rigid and joyless as you. For a split second, the words cut deep. Harold's name was always my weak spot. But then instead of breaking, something inside me steadied. They had finally shown themselves for what they were. Not family. Not loved ones in a rough patch. Just users. I straightened my shoulders, looked Martin squarely in the eye, and said calmly, the Bank of Elaine is permanently closed. Caroline's face went pale. Martin's turned red. They sputtered, they scolded, they even tried to guilt me one last time, but I didn't waver. My hands didn't tremble. My voice didn't crack. When I finally ushered them to the door, Martin muttered something about me regretting this, about how I wasn't as independent as I thought. I closed the door behind them with the firmest click I've ever heard. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of their disappointment. I was too busy rediscovering my own strength. The quiet after that showdown was cold at first, like stepping out of a warm kitchen into January air, but it was peaceful too. My phone, which used to buzz like a beehive, sat still on the counter. No urgent messages. No surprise visits. Just me, my kettle, and a house that seemed to breathe easier. I needed something to pour myself into that wasn't a checkbook. So I drove to the community center and walked into the Textile Arts Guild meeting with a tin of lemon bars and my favorite hand-pieced quilt folded over my arm. The room smelled like starch and coffee, and the tables were lined with thimbles, pin cushions, and fat quarters stacked like little books. I felt at home the way you do when you walk into an old church and know where the creaky pews are. They asked for show and tell, and I laid out my quilt, Harold's favorite pattern, a churn dash in teal and cream. There was a small chorus of ohs and wows that landed on my shoulders like a shawl. Someone asked how I got my points so crisp. Negotiate with them, I said. Promise them cookies if they behave. That got a laugh, and just like that, I wasn't the new lady. I was Elaine, who knows her way around a quarter-inch seam. Within 2 weeks, I was leading a Saturday workshop, hand quilting without losing your patience. I brought my hoop collection, my jar of beeswax, and a basket of thread spools in every shade of sky. We practiced rocking stitches, and when one woman fretted over her wobbly lines, I told her, darling, perfection is for museum guards and parking tickets. Quilts should show a pulse. She cried a little. Then she laughed a lot. That's when I met Edward. He was there to help the Historical Society table. The guild partnered with them to document old textile patterns. He's a retired librarian with a voice like a well-tuned cello and a grin that sneaks up on you. He complimented my binding corners, which is not the worst line I've heard, and asked if I'd ever seen the county's archive of farm quilts. I hadn't. He promised to show me the catalog and kept the promise. We started with coffee after meetings. He'd bring a slim book about regional dyes or a folder of old photographs, and I'd bring oatmeal cookies or leftover lemon bars. We sat by the big window talking about dye lots and the way blues fade into gentler versions of themselves. He told me about indexing a lifetime of stories and how satisfying it is when a thing lands exactly where it belongs. I told him about Harold planting the maple tree and how I still hear the creak of his boots on the porch sometimes, not like a ghost, more like a memory joining me for tea. The guild gave me projects. organizing a quilt documentation day, writing little labels for our exhibit, teaching the teens how to thread needles without cussing. I used the word humbug, and it worked just fine. My calendar filled with honest plans. No emergency scribbles, just steady good work. My hands were busy, my mind sharper than it had been in years. And at night the house felt content, the way a finished block feels when the seams press flat. Edward started saving me a seat at lectures. I started saving him the corner piece of coffee cake. One evening, after we finished labeling an entire bin of vintage feed sacks, he asked if I'd like dinner. Nothing fancy, he said. But the diner does pot roast on Wednesdays and I have a 2-for-1 coupon that's burning a hole in my wallet. I said yes, and we talked until the waitress flipped the sign to closed. It was not the fireworks kind of beginning. It was gentler, like a quilt growing under your hands. Small stitches adding up to something warm. I felt light. Not drained. Not used. I felt like myself again. Only a little brighter, like someone had finally opened the curtains. Months later, the dust finally settled. Caroline and Martin sold their big house, the one with the sunroom they claimed needed urgent repairs. Turns out, without my checks rolling in, they couldn't keep up the payments. They moved into a smaller place across town. Perfectly nice, mind you, but without the vaulted ceilings and extra bathrooms no one needed in the first place. Caroline still calls now and then. Our conversations are polite, but there's a stiffness in her tone, like she's afraid one wrong word will make me hang up. She never mentions money. Not once. Not in passing, not even in hints. I imagine she learned that particular lesson the hard way. Sometimes I wish our talks could be lighter, warmer like they used to be when she was young. But at least now, what's left between us is honest. I'd rather have strained honesty than false closeness built on my dwindling savings. Daniel, on the other hand, has become my rock. He stops by with a bag of groceries now and then, claiming the oranges at his store are better than mine. Nonsense, but I let him say it. And more often than not, he brings Emma along. She's 7, full of mischief, and has discovered that my sewing room is the most fascinating place in the world. She'll sit at my feet, playing with fabric scraps, lining them up like puzzle pieces. Sometimes she insists she's designing her own quilt. I let her, even if it looks more like a pile of laundry than a pattern. Her laughter fills the room in a way that patches something in me. I watch her giggle, tangled up in colorful scraps, and I remember Caroline at that age, doing the very same thing with Harold's old flannel shirts. It's bittersweet but mostly sweet. Emma doesn't see me as a bank or a burden. She sees me as grandma, the one with the button jar and the endless stories. And here's the kicker, the part one still shake my head over. Martin's cruel little jab at that banquet, the one that burned me up inside? It turned out to be the best thing that ever happened. If he hadn't humiliated me in front of all those people, I might still be writing checks, convincing myself it was just helping. I might still be blind to the contempt behind those forced smiles. That joke was the spark that lit the fire under me, and thank heavens for it. Now things look different. My retirement fund is no longer bleeding out through someone else's mortgage. Sylvia helped me set up protection so I don't have to worry about surprise emergencies draining me dry again. Clara, the attorney, made sure my house is locked up tight in a trust, so no one can guilt me into selling or signing it away. For the first time since Harold passed, I feel secure. Not just financially, but personally. I turned 70 this year. People groan about milestone birthdays, but honestly, I feel lighter than I did at 60. Lighter because the weight of being someone's hidden safety net is gone. Lighter because I'm finally using my time and money on things that bring me joy: quilting projects, guild meetings, long dinners with Edward, afternoons with Emma. The Bank of Elaine is closed forever. That much is certain. But Elaine herself? Well, she's finally open for business, the kind of business that has nothing to do with checks or balance sheets, and everything to do with living fully. Flourishing, as Harold would say, like a maple tree in spring. And that, to me, is worth more than all the money in the world.
Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family over money? How did it go? If you liked the story, subscribe to the channel and give us a like.